Zack Snyder has landed in an unusual spot of being a filmmaker whose director's cuts are typically significantly better than the studio cuts of his films. He's an artist whose big ambitions to make huge cinematic epics, which push genre boundaries, have always been at odds with studios' customs and preferences for runtime and mass marketability. As a compromise, Snyder makes his films and then truncates them into the shorter versions the studios demand, later to be allowed to release his versions of them as director's cuts. This tends to result in the studio cuts of his films having underdeveloped stories, and so being critically panned. In certain significant cases, because the story structures of Snyder's films have been built for much longer runtimes, cutting them down beyond a certain limit simply doesn't work. Snyder seems to be one of, if not the only director in this position, where half the time it's just expected that the initial release of a new film he's made will be the incomplete version of what's to come later. The two Rebel Moon films Snyder made for Netflix are the latest to receive critical condemnation. Now with Snyder's much longer and more adult director's cuts of these films released, has the cycle repeated? Are these director's cuts leagues above the studio cuts, or are they just longer versions with a bit more violence and nudity? Let's get into that now. Of course, there'll be spoilers ahead. I'll start with a brief summary of my thoughts on the studio cuts of these films. While I think some of the criticism of Rebel Moon Part 1 was excessive, there was a lot of fair criticism too. Despite this, I enjoyed the film as a piece of light, wacky entertainment. It has flaws which I'll discuss later in this video, but overall I found it to be good fun. Part 2, on the other hand, I did not enjoy. While the film has its moments, overall I find it very boring, and to have a lot of underdeveloped elements. The acting by certain members of the cast is awful for both films, but I found the plot and spectacle in Rebel Moon Part 1 to be sufficient to substitute the acting deficiency, and certain other deficiencies the film has. That was not the case for Part 2, where the bad acting accentuated the other flaws. So I suppose that leaves me with mixed feelings on the property as a whole, for these studio cuts anyway. But now I'll move on to the director's cuts. We'll start with some of the main differences in these cuts, and the overall effect these differences have on the quality and vibe of Rebel Moon. The opening of the Rebel Moon Part 1 studio cut has a big info dump, with Jimmy explaining the history of the story's royal family and Imperium. That's not in the director's cut. The director's cut communicates this lore with some lengthy exposition, but also by actually showing more of it through the film in flashbacks and through context of what's going on in the present. The story is slightly improved with this change. The Part 1 director's cut also opens with a prologue that's not in the studio cut. This may be the best section of the film actually. It's really cool and sets a new, more intense tone immediately, with the Imperium brutally conquering a planet, dragging nuns into the street, stripping them naked and branding them with branding irons. There's also more character backstory and world building provided here. At the end of this prologue, the origin of Aris, the defector Imperium soldier, is shown. He's a teenager in this section, and is taken away by the Imperium to be made a soldier, after being forced through an extremely traumatizing trial. This leads me on to the point that certain characters in these director's cuts are given more character development and backstory, which makes them more interesting, and the films more compelling. Jimmy is woefully underused and underdeveloped in the studio cuts, but in the director's cuts, he's given extra scenes to provide a more clear character arc. These extra scenes can still be criticised because a lot of them are all quite similar, just showing Jimmy wandering around and interacting with nature. So a bit more variety here would have been even better, but repetitive though they may be, these scenes in themselves are each nice and depict Jimmy as a robot having to rebuild his identity after having his purpose stripped away. He's shown becoming more entwined with nature. We learn where he gets the antlers he wears in the director's cut, and are given the context we need to know why he wears them. As far as I can tell, it's to show this new relationship he's forming with nature, going back to the soil to let nature rebirth him. The scene where he stands in the rain, the water washing over him, is symbolic of baptismal rebirth. Jimmy is really the most interesting and likeable character in this film, no doubt contributed to by the fact that the most seasoned and capable actor of the cast voices him. Overall, the studio cuts of Rebel Moon feel like fairly dull Star Wars rip-offs. With the extra breathing room and adult edge to this story the director's cuts provide, Rebel Moon feels less like a dull Star Wars rip-off and more like a story in its own right that takes inspiration from other sources. The world building feels more unique and expansive in the director's cuts. A lot of the most interesting stuff related to this is not in the studio cuts, making them feel more generic and derivative. There's more build up to the reveal that Princess Issa is still alive, and more general expansion of the lore about her and the royal family in the director's cuts. In the studio cuts, the reveal at the end of the story that she's still alive is a bit random, with insufficient build up to it. But in the director's cuts, it feels more appropriate, because Princess Issa is made out to be more significant, a figure whose memory still haunts the universe. It's clear she's still relevant, and there's regular foreshadowing of her return throughout the director's cuts. A few more generalised points of praise: Rebel Moon has a stylish and distinctive aesthetic, making it immediately recognisable from a single frame. It also has a good score by Junkie XL. Junkie XL scored Zack Snyder's Justice League, and there are some parts of the Rebel Moon score that sound very similar to parts of Zack Snyder's Justice League. There are some very well put together sequences where the music is used nicely in conjunction with what's on screen. One of the most memorable instances of this is when the giant, mysterious cosmic woman is used to transport the Imperium dreadnought ship through a wormhole across space. She cries afterwards, and her giant tears are filled with galaxies. That's pretty cool. She's one of my favourite aspects of the films, given most of her scenes in the director's cuts. In the studio cuts, she's only shown briefly in passing, and we're given no information about her, as far as I remember. She's a part of the set rather than a part of the lore in those cuts. The history established about the royal family and how the Imperium rose after the royals were murdered is quite interesting. Moving on to the flaws with these director's cuts. The flaws with these films are almost entirely the same as the flaws with the studio cuts. The acting by certain members of the main cast is frankly terrible. While I mentioned having more of Jimmy in these cuts is an improvement on what came before, he's still underused, since he's by far the most compelling character. There's another character who's set up to be one of the most compelling, and that's Aris, who I mentioned is given an origin story in the prologue of the Part 1 director's cut. However, ultimately, his story doesn't really go anywhere. He ends up breaking away from the Imperium, joining the fight against them, and he and Sam get together by the end of the story, which is nice. But his introduction in the Part 1 prologue implied he was going to have a much more significant role. Instead, his arc ends up being rather weak. So, like Jimmy, he's another character with good potential who's underused and underdeveloped. There's a lot of really good stuff in these films, but they're let down by a few critical flaws. One of the biggest of these flaws is the deficit of compelling characters. The main character, Cora, has some interesting elements to her backstory. Execution of this reveal aside, I think the twist that she's the assassin of Princess Issa is a pretty good element of the story, but other than that, there's not really anything engaging about Cora. Like I've said, there are multiple secondary characters more compelling than this protagonist, and that's not ideal. This is a cool and interesting world Snyder's built, but without characters we care about following on a journey through it, it just doesn't have the impact it should. In conclusion, these films are ambitious attempts to make a new, sprawling, interesting, unique IP. There are some really cool ideas in these director's cuts that regrettably aren't integrated or expanded on as well as they could have been, which combined with the other flaws discussed dragged the whole story down. Like the studio cut, I found the Part 1 director's cut to be enjoyable, and I think it is better than the studio cut. The Part 2 director's cut, again, is better than the studio cut, but is still the weaker of the two Rebel Moon chapters, and isn't a film I have any enthusiasm to revisit. So ultimately, the trend of Snyder's director's cuts being leagues better than the studio cuts of his films is not followed here. While the Rebel Moon director's cuts are an improvement on what came before, many of the flaws of the studio cuts are still present in these versions. The Rebel Moon universe is pretty cool, and has a lore around the history of the royal family and Imperium I'm still interested in, so I would be enthusiastic about future stories told in this universe, but ideally with a different main character, and all the other flaws I've mentioned addressed. Anyway, what do you think? Do you agree with my take on these director's cuts? Or don't you? Let me know in the comments below. Leave a like if you enjoyed, and subscribe for more. Thanks for watching, see you next time.